Hello National 5 historians, and welcome to the next lesson in our Hitler-Nazi Germany topic. This lesson is looking at some of the characteristics of the German Nazi government, and in particular we're looking at propaganda. So for this lesson, what you need to be able to do by the end of it is to explain how the Nazis used propaganda to control the population, and maybe give some examples of that propaganda and how successful it really was. So put the title somewhere that you're using for your notes and continue the lesson. So in terms of characteristics of the Nazi government, there's a few different things that we can talk about here. The one that we're going to focus on for this lesson is propaganda, but in amongst this there are a few different things that the propaganda picks up on. Racism is one characteristic. Germans are the master race and all other races are inferior and they either have to be removed or made into slaves of the master race. We've got this idea of revenge, so the German pride must be restored with the destruction of the Treaty of Versailles. We've got autarky, which is the word that means self-sufficiency. So Germany would become self-sufficient and not rely on the goods imported from other countries. They would be able to stand on their own. Liberarum, which is this idea of expansion to territories they need in order to let the master race grow. They need to take land that's nearby that they can actually use as well. And the last one being the Führer principle. There must be one single leader who is in charge of a single party who has total power. And these things, the propaganda explaining that life is better under Nazi rule, racism, revenge, autarky, Lebensraum, the Führer principle, all of these different things are the main characteristics of what make up the Nazi government and the government under Hitler's control. Now, in propaganda, each of these things are going to be kind of touched on, and you can see where they are coming in as we kind of go through this lesson, and this is what kind of makes up the message that the Nazis are trying to convey to the people about how their government is going to work and about what the main characteristics of it actually are and what it's founded on. So if you want to make a note of this slide so you've got it as a nice wee summary, you can, you don't have to, and move on just when you're ready. So one reason, back to our opposition lesson, that opposition was actually so little in Germany was as a result of the work of this man, Dr. Joseph Goebbels. His title was Minister for Propaganda and Enlightenment. He was a fanatic follower of Hitler. He genuinely believed that Hitler was the saviour of Germany who had been chosen by God to do this job. His job was to persuade, convince or brainwash other Germans into believing this as well. And it was Goebbels who decided what the people could hear, see or experience in Germany as the Minister of Enlightenment and Propaganda, and most of the messages that came out from the propaganda would reflect these characteristics that the Nazi government were trying to put forward, and that was his job to do this. He joined the Nazis in 1922 and he became the head Minister of Propaganda and Enlightenment in 1933 after Hitler was made Chancellor. A couple of his more famous quotes, he says, "If you repeat a lie often, people will believe it, and you will even come to believe it yourself." He also says propaganda works best when those who are being manipulated are confident that they are acting on their own free will. And the most brilliant propagandist technique must confine itself to a few points and repeat it over and over. Simple key points linked back to these characteristics, which he would repeat consistently over and over and over again until the people actually start to believe it comes from their views, they're doing it willingly, it's them that want to do it. And there's a nice wee link here talking about Goebbels in a little bit in more detail that you can have a look at by clicking on it in the team and adding any information you want to any notes that you're making just now, and then continue with the rest of the lesson. So the Ministry of Popular Enlightenment and Propaganda was created to organise all Nazi propaganda, the core of which was that to be a good German you also had to be a good Nazi. The two were synonymous with one another. They organised a book burning campaign in May of 1933 where all good Germans were encouraged to take part and burn books that were considered to be against the Nazi way of thinking, books by Jewish authors, books that promoted weakness, so for example Bambi, because he misses his mother, just as an example. Hitler and the Nazi Party were a constant presence in the life of the German people. You could not get away from them. The infamous swastika symbol appeared on every government uniform, every public building. Pictures of Hitler were literally displayed everywhere. The Germans were having to greet each other with the Hail Hitler salute, which was common practice after a little while. We've talked about propaganda quite a bit here, but we need to really think about what we're defining propaganda is. Basically, propaganda is a one-sided argument that is used to influence people, and the name of the person that was put in charge of this is Joseph Goebbels. The aim for propaganda really was to convince Germany that living under Nazi control was worth the loss of the civil freedoms that they had actually had during the Weimar age, and to create a sense of success and achievement. They wanted to feel like they were actually achieving. It had to be short and simple, and it had to appeal to emotions or to be based in one of these characteristics. So the revenge for the Treaty of Versailles, the racism against the Jewish people, the need for kind of the master race, the superiority element of things, the need for more space, this idea of being independent, the one leader Führer, all of these things, they would appeal to the emotions of the German people, which is why propaganda was focused in this way. Hitler's view on it: he knew that effective propaganda had to be simple and easily remembered, and he used simple slogans and just repeated them over and over in his own speeches. He actually wrote, "The intelligence of the masses is small, their forgetfulness is great. They must be told the same thing 1,000 times." Basically what he's saying here is, we're just going to keep it small and simple because people are too stupid to realise what we're doing, or to actually take anything in if it's too complicated. Whether he believed this or not, I don't think he believed everyone was stupid. I think he thought that if he told them it a certain way, like Goebbels said, and he continuously told them it, they would start to believe it was their idea. And that's kind of the whole point behind the Nazi propaganda message. So propaganda is generally biased information. It is created to share public opinion and behaviour. It simplifies complex issues or ideas. It's using symbols, images, words or music, often quite a lot. It will always play on an emotion of some sort. It advertises a cause, an organisation or movement and its opponents. It directs human action towards a given goal. It can be true, partially true, or just blatantly false information depending on what type of propaganda is being used. And there are a couple of different common propaganda techniques. As we go through each of the next couple of slides, we're going to look at what these techniques mean and an example of how the Nazis used it in their rise to power, or in keeping control. So there's 8 of them altogether. You might want to write them down and then give an example beside each one. So just write the numbers 1 to 8 and copy this slide out in a wee bit in more detail. So you might want to put something like these things, and as we kind of go through, you could write a sentence beside each one as a point explaining what it is and the example that the Nazis actually used. So bandwagons. This type of propaganda is an appeal to the subject to follow the crowd, so jump on the bandwagon. It tries to convince the person that's watching it that one side is the winning side and that them winning is inevitable. It appeals to that person's desire to be on the winning side. And if we were putting a sentence beside that one, it would be this top one here. And this is a good example. Everyone listens to the Führer, so you want to be on the winning side. You want to be on that side. Everyone does it, you want to do it as well. Really simple, really straightforward, and actually really effective. Testimonials are quotations or endorsements which attempt to connect a well-known or respectable person with a product or with an ideal with the intent to better sell it or get people to be more in line with it. So for this one we would say attempt to connect a well-known or respectable person with an ideal. And these are some examples then. What happened for Hitler and the Nazis was having Ludendorff part of the Nazi party during the failed Munich putsch, the beer hall putsch, in trying to take over. This kind of gave them a level of respectability almost with Ludendorff on board, but obviously we know that didn't quite work out. But that was almost a piece of propaganda as well. Plain folks basically attempt to convince the public that the views that they're seeing is reflected of the common person views. It's working for the benefit of the common person. And in terms of the bits that we would actually use with that, it would be this one here, which I can't highlight in yellow because it is yellow, would be what I would write beside it. And here's a good example. Workers in posters, we are for Adolf Hitler, is just another key example of this. Transfer, basically take a view of a certain item and make them view it the same way as they view something positive. So transfer a negative positive feeling onto one object or another is basically what we have to do. Now you don't have to be writing these, but if you are writing them because you're interested, you can be just summarising this bit. And it's a good example from modern day. People like Santa Claus. Santa Claus likes Coca-Cola, so people like Coca-Cola. Is kind of what we're doing here. This is a good example. This is the enemy. It's the Nazi symbol, obviously on a sleeve, stabbing through the Holy Bible. This is part of this idea of trying to convince the German people that the church's organised religion is actually bad for them. Fear or card stacking. Now, basically in this you only present information that is positive to an idea or proposal and omits any information against it. While the information presented is true, all of the other information is purposely omitted. They're stacking the deck basically in a positive way for them. So for example, communists burnt down the Reichstag. Communism is a threat to everyone and everything. That is a fact. Communists burning down the Reichstag would be a threat. Did the communists actually burn down the Reichstag? Probably not. There was a communist found. Was he responsible? We don't know. Everyone then being threatened? Definitely not true, but that's something that they could say quite easily. So using that as a kind of way to build fear and to stack the cards in their way. Logical fallacies, these can also sometimes be known as myths. This is the argument that sounds as if it makes sense, but the conclusions don't provide proper support for that argument. So the example that's given here are penguins are black and white. Some old TV shows are black and white, so that means that because both of these things are black and white, some penguins are also old TV shows. The way you get there, the premise is right, but the conclusion is wrong. In Nazi Germany, an example of this type of propaganda was using the Treaty of Versailles to blame things on. So for example, this Treaty of Versailles is to blame for the economic issues in Germany. The Weimar politicians signed the Treaty of Versailles. The Weimar government is therefore responsible for the economic issues in Germany. That is not necessarily true, but that's the conclusion that we come to because they signed the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles is to blame for that, and therefore they're to blame for that. And that piece of propaganda is repeated over and over. Glittering generalities then uses words that have different positive meanings for individual subjects but are linked to a highly valued concept. Words can be used like honour, glory, the love of the country, freedom, we can believe in it, change, things like that. Just a generality that you can make a general term and make people believe in it. In Nazi Germany, posters like this with these slogans, so it says open the door to freedom, put a strong man at the helm, out of the swamp, forward with the powers of renewal. So it's this idea of renewal and building up Germany once more. And it's a general kind of term, not about how they're going to do it or things like that, just a general term that the Nazis are going to use. And again, this message being repeated over and over in these pamphlets that are being handed out. Name calling, exactly as it sounds, use derogatory language or words that carry negative sort of feelings when you describe someone you don't like. Attempt to kind of arouse prejudice amongst the public by labelling the target as something that the public dislikes. This is because of these people, for example. And the Jew, the inciter of war, the prolonger of war, that's a good example from Nazi Germany of that particular piece of propaganda. So, in terms of Hitler and a propaganda machine, Hitler's definitely the star that most Germans actually wanted to see and hear. Before his speeches, he rehearsed carefully, he made each speech a performance, he manipulated the crowds, arriving late, standing in silence to increase the tension. He would start slowly and then seem to reach into the kind of inner fears and the hopes of each person. He's making general claims, but using this idea of this glittering generality, he's actually taking what they think is their individual fears, their individual hopes, which makes them think he's speaking directly to them. In a lot of ways, people that spoke about how he was as a public speaker, an orator, say that he was spellbinding. But what he actually said, nobody could really tell you why it was spellbinding, because what he said was actually very simple. He repeated the same information and the main points over and over again, trying to just make sure that they were more passionate and more heard, so that by the end of the speech, everybody thought what he was saying was their ideas, and what he was actually saying was the things that they wanted. And that's how propaganda actually works, to try and encourage people to come along with them. And it's also why there was so much support in Germany, whereas the opposition groups actually didn't have quite as much support as they potentially could have had propaganda not been so effective. So, in terms of what the main areas of propaganda, now we've seen what types of propaganda they used, we're going to think about what actual areas of propaganda they would use it in. So how would they do it? And what we're going to do is we're going to take a note for each of these. So the first one they would use is posters. Now, posters were placed in prominent positions, and they basically acted as a constant reminder of Nazi ideology, so the beliefs of the Nazis. They're cheap and easy to distribute and make. The swastika and the bold colours were used to capture the public attention. The visual effects, being quite striking, would reach the viewer quite easily. Hitler's picture and name was everywhere. He was shown as the saviour of the Germans, and they used slogans on the posters like "One people, one leader, one empire," "Free Germany from the Jews," "Smash communism." And this imagery frequently drew on the kind of heroic realism. Nazi youth and the SS were depicted sort of momentally with lighting posed to produce sort of this grandeur effect. They also picked on different minority groups and things as well. So we could say Nazi youth and the SS were depicted momentally. They also picked on different minority groups through posters. Okay, so maybe pause the video there if you needed just a second or two to make a note for posters, and then move on to the next section. Here's some good examples of posters. We've seen one or two of them, like the Hitler Youth ones, though, like this one for example, you can see the Hitler Youth, you know, smiling, happy children, Hitler with children to encourage that kind of thing, Hitler as the last hope of Germany, this idea of, you know, the Nazis, workers together building a better Germany. And then you've got these kind of more negative, the Jews, the communism flag, this kind of what they're actually up to in the background, very scary looking characters. Good example for posters is this one. If you think about what this poster actually tells us about Nazi beliefs regarding the family and family life, What about the Nazi attitudes regarding the role of women in this? For obviously every Nazi idea, aim or policy, there's going to be an accompanying piece of propaganda, and this is one example of it. So if we look at what this actually stands for, it says the eagle in the background, which is basically the state. The wings of the eagle are surrounding the family. See, it's like it's cuddling the family, protecting it, protecting the family. So this idea of the Nazi state will protect your family. The father is above the family, so he's sort of slightly taller. He's looking down on everybody. He is the protector, the most important member. The mother's caring for a baby. She's got a scarf on her head which represents domestic work, domestic life. She obviously has now 3 children, which means, you know, obviously it's a good thing. They're happy, they're healthy children. They've all got blonde hair. They're all examples of the perfect Aryan master race. So this takes this ideal of this like self-sufficiency, it takes this ideal of the master race principle from the characteristics, and it's showing the state as this kind of leader protecting its families and protecting its people. Okay, radios then, for point 2. Radios were used quite often. In the 1930s, radios and newspapers were actually the only way the outside world could get into German homes, and the Nazis knew this. So by 1939, 70% of the German people owned a radio. There were more radios in Germany in the 1930s than anywhere else in the world at that time, and that is not a coincidence. The Nazis made the radios quite cheap so that they could be bought by everybody, but also so that they would not actually pick up on foreign frequencies. They only got domestic frequencies. It was a treasonable offence to listen to foreign stations. If you were caught, you went to a concentration camp. The radio was used so that mass audiences could hear Hitler's very well rehearsed speeches, even if they couldn't see him in person. Key messages were simple and repeated regularly. They were in cafes, they were in schools and factories. Speakers were even placed in the streets so that no matter where you were, you could hear the radio broadcasts. And the Nazi people had their own jingles. So radio tunes that would play before one of the Nazi members would actually come on to speak. So you could hear a sound and you would know, oh, that's Dr. Goebbels coming on, that noise means Himmler's coming on, oh, that noise is Hitler. And everybody would be excited to hear the noise and then obviously the song play and then hear the speech or whoever it was. So radios were used really, really effectively. Good examples of sort of images with that. You saw posters and pictures being made, photos of, you know, army men sitting around listening to the radio. You've got people buying the radios from the Nazis, you know, lots of them, big crowds to buy them. You've got Hitler sitting by his own radio with his cup of tea listening to what's going on. You've got the families gathered around the radio, dad reading the newspaper in uniform or in nice dress. You've got the children listening to the radio while the mum's knitting. That sort of image was used quite effectively to show that the radios were a very important part of your life, and a good German family would obviously have one. Okay, third thing that we're looking at is film. In 1933, before they actually got to power, German cinema had an audience of about 250 million people. Goebbels recognised film as a major way to influence the masses quite effectively, so films were then used to show Hitler in a very positive light. The Nazis produced quite a lot of films to promote their views, using the party's Department of Film for organising film propaganda. Under both Hitler and Goebbels, the German film industry became entirely nationalised. They commissioned over 100,000 films. And from 1934, directors had to send the plots of their films to Goebbels to get approval to ensure that he could insert some propaganda or make sure it was the right message. One example of a film that was made at the time was The Eternal Jew. Anti-Semitic film, compared the Jews to rats. It's estimated that roughly about 45 million people attended film screenings put on at that point in time under Nazi reign. Schools were also provided with motion picture projectors because films were regarded as particularly appropriate for propagandising children. The goal of the Department of Film was not directly political in nature, but was to influence the culture. So it's an influence the culture, education and entertainment of the general population, not necessarily just the political aspects. Posters and things of the films. You can see Jewish ones are, very negative looking stereotypes of Jews. You've got the good German youth and the German eagle and things like that for the kind of action films where Germany will be saved by these people as well. So there were 4,700 daily newspapers in 1933. By the end of 1934, the Nazis had banned many of them, and a lot of them had closed down. The newspapers were censored, meaning they could only print the views that the Nazis approved of and that were Nazi positive. Journalists were given press briefings with the news that the government wanted them to print. There was an official newspaper of the Nazi Party. It was joined by others, founded by people like Goebbels. It was mainly dedicated to attacks against political opponents and Jewish people. One of the most striking features was the anti-Semitic cartoons, which you can see examples of here. The Jewish person crushing the kind of German worker underneath all of these things. After Hitler's rise to power, all the regular press came under complete Nazi control through the policy of Nazi control. And here's some examples of some newspapers and their kind of headlines here. In terms of photos then, the Nazis used photographs to document events and promote ideology. Hitler actually had an official photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann. He joined the Nazi Party in April 1920, and he was the only man authorised to take official photographs of Hitler. Hitler would practice poses and positions before the camera. We've got photos taken by Hoffmann that actually show this. Some photographs were widely reproduced and they became postcards or trading cards on cigarette packets and things like that. We've got generally sort of outbreaks of propaganda and stuff like that being used for encouraging people to join the Hitler Youth, used for books and things like that, even postage stamps. And eventually Hoffmann becomes a millionaire purely from the royalties on the photos that he actually took. So here's the picture of the practicing of the poses. You can see here. Pictures of Hitler in the crowds when the war was actually supposedly announced. That's a restaging. And obviously pictures of the rallies and things, and postage stamps and things there as well. Photos of things like the book burnings, which you can see all of the good Germans standing burning the books and getting involved. They became really popular as a way to explain to people who weren't necessarily involved why they should be, and encourage them to get involved in these events in future. Okay, number 6 is the Olympic Games in 1936. So these were held in Berlin, and it was basically the perfect opportunity for Hitler and Goebbels to show the world how powerful the Aryan race really was. During the Games, anti-Semitic posters were removed and persecution ceased. It was a huge public relations triumph for the Nazis. The Olympic Stadium was completed on time and it held 100,000 spectators. A good comparison for that would be how much money and effort had gone into the London 2012 Olympics, which was actually only able to hold 80,000. Total ticket prices reached over 1 million marks of profit. It's the very first time that the Olympic torch was carried between Greece and the host nation, so it became a massive victory for the German people. and it's also the very first to have live TV coverage. Now, in order to keep the racially pure image, gypsies and things were arrested, rounded up and taken to nearby concentration camps during the games, but apart from that it was a propaganda and media success. There's some myths involved though in this. Lutz Long, who was a German athlete superstar, he was basically the perfect Aryan, but he didn't do as well as Jesse Owens, an African American, and according to the Nazi ideals, an inferior athlete. Owens won 4 gold medals, and the myth is that Hitler became so angry that a black man had won that he refused to present the medal. It's actually not true. He did leave the stadium early when another African American won gold, but it wasn't Owens, and he actually wasn't there when Owens won at all, so he didn't present the medals at all. Number 7 is the Nuremberg rallies. Now, these were really key. They'd been held every year since 1923, and they became a huge propaganda event showing off Nazi power. They were officially called the National Congress of the Party of the German Peoples, linking the government and the people. Very, very wordy. They grew each year until the late 1930s, which saw over 500,000 people taking part. There was vast displays of athletic and military strength. There were mock battles, torchlit parades, a lot of atmosphere of noise. There was Nazi symbols and music. The crowd would be worked into a frenzy, and then Hitler would give his rally speech. He would keep them waiting, and then he would appear, make the slow start, work into the emotion, basically show the real military power that Germany had to offer at this point in time. It was a massive success. It increased militarism, and that's going to be necessary if they're planning for war. However, what isn't shown in some of the aspects of this success is that actually the Nuremberg rallies took so much power and so much electricity that some nearby villages were actually completely blacked out as a result of it to actually give the power to the rally. And in some of the rallies where you see the military might, where you see people marching, hundreds and hundreds of people in the military, especially later on towards the war era, is actually not as many people as you would like to think. They were just told to continue walking. So they went round in a circle, out one end, back into the other, so that it looked like there was more people than there actually were. In some of the tank displays and things like that, some of the machines were actually made of wood and cardboard and had people inside them. From a distance you wouldn't tell, and it made it look like they had more military might than they actually did. But again, as a propaganda piece, very, very powerful and very, very important. Ultimately, why was propaganda important to the Nazis? It was a control tool for establishing and keeping control of the people. Evidence that went against the Nazi principles were censored, and discussion on differing points of view was discouraged, but kept them in line. Since the Nazis controlled the information, it was hard for the ordinary Germans to see, hear or read any anti-Nazi views, and the Germans were told what to think. Or were they? That's something that we need to kind of consider. Basically, for this one, it was a control tool. Evidence that are against is discouraged. Censorship means that they can't see other things. It's hard for people to hear or read any Nazi views, and the Germans are told what to think. This is one of the reasons why opposition fails. This is what they're aiming for. Through propaganda, they're aiming for total control over all areas of the German society. Did it work? Okay. Recent research from historians suggests that propaganda did not actually really persuade people to believe something they didn't want to. The educated middle classes accepted it because it told them what they wanted to believe, that Hitler was saving Germany, that Jews were wicked, and that Germany hadn't really lost the war, and so on. And the main thing that propaganda does is that it directs thoughts already there the way you want it to go. So really, It did work in certain respects, but it didn't change people's minds. So evidence of success then, you could draw both these tables out under the heading that we just highlighted. So in the short term, propaganda played an important role in getting Hitler into power and then advertising his main ideas. The general lack of resistance to the Nazi regime is an important indication that propaganda was effective, and for young people, propaganda had a very lasting effect. In terms of failure, the older and more educated people were generally less susceptible to propaganda because they'd been brought up with different values. The concentration camps were full of political prisoners, and if it was working, there wouldn't be any. And it's hard to tell if the lack of resistance to the Nazis was due to propaganda or the police state. Both of those things at the same time, perhaps, carrot and stick policy. So, summary task for you, just to kind of get an idea of what we've talked about. To collect a summary worksheet, complete it using now what you know about propaganda to help you, and make sure that it is easily accessible in your notes. Any questions or anything you're not sure about, email, ask in your team or ask your teacher, and let us know how you're getting on.